Now, let's move on to the next chapters, tips and tricks. And now we will talk about the stakeholder tips and tricks. Now, earlier in those general tips and tricks, we talked about stakeholders, especially the conflicting situations or the disagreement situations with the stakeholders. Here we will go into more details with the stakeholders. Remember, these are tips and tricks, so sort of a summary of the training plus tips and tricks to help you, understand how to handle and deal with handle and deal with the stakeholders. Remember that a stakeholder is anyone who is interested or involved in the project, anyone who can influence the project work, or anyone who might be impacted by the project results. Okay, stakeholders, they can be supportive to the project, they can be resistant against the project, or they can be simply neutral. Stakeholders must be involved throughout the project, and you as a project manager, you must capture all the requirements and expectations. And of course, stakeholders have the most influence on the project at the beginning. Okay, so the most influence stakeholders can have on a project is at the beginning. All right, so you must make sure that you capture all of the requirements and expectations and be able to deliver the value or the work to them correctly as expected. So let me put it here, because I don't know if it's mentioned in the next page. So stakeholders have highest influence at the beginning of the project. Okay, let's put it in here, and if I find it somewhere else, then I will remove it. Okay, just I write it down so I won't forget it. Okay, the sponsor is the one who assigns the project manager, provides him or her with the authority, the necessary authority to manage the project, and the resources, of course. The sponsor supports the team and is considered as the first escalation point in case of any matter or situation that is beyond the power or the authority of the project manager or the team. Okay. The sponsor is part of the steering committee, and the customer also is considered as a key stakeholder, because in the exam you will have questions that asks you how to handle a situation with a stakeholder and how to handle a situation with a key stakeholder. Okay, we will see those questions and the difference between them, because there is a difference between managing a stakeholder and managing a key stakeholder. Okay, when there is a new stakeholder, make sure that you update the stakeholder register, the communication plan, and the engagement plan. Okay, so these are usually the steps that you need to do when you have a new stakeholder in your project. Okay, so when there's a new stakeholder, new key stakeholder, update the stakeholder register, communication plan, and the engagement plan. If there is a deliverable that is complete, but it is rejected by the stakeholder and they say that it does not respond to their expectations, then correct the deliverable, review the scope management plan. Why do you need to review the scope management plan? Because the scope management plan, it includes the requirements, the acceptance criteria. So obviously, if a deliverable is complete and it was rejected by the by a stakeholder, that means it did not respect the expectations or the acceptance criteria, and thus you need to go back to the scope management plan and review it, because probably you've missed something in there related to the acceptance criteria or to the requirement itself, etc. Okay. All right. Always when the question mentions a key stakeholder, that means they've got high power, high interest, and a key stakeholder with a high power, high interest, you need to manage them closely. Make sure you manage them closely. All right. All data about the stakeholders are recorded in the stakeholders register. And it's not just, when we say stakeholders, we don't mean just a sponsor or customer, but also vendors, for example, senior management, PMO, suppliers, etc. Contractors also, those are all considered as stakeholders. Okay. The Change Control Board, CCB, okay, let me write it fully, all right? Let me write it fully. So the Change Control, actually, let's type it. Change Control Board, which is the CCB. Okay, so I need to mention that at least once fully in this presentation. So the Change Control Board, CCB, it reviews and it approves or it rejects the changes but only in waterfall, sometimes also in hybrid. Now, guys, we're gonna have tips and tricks about the hybrid project management. And remember, hybrid is a mix between predictive and adaptive. So usually, when we talk about certain practice or certain tool, and we mentioned in waterfall, keep in mind that if we say that's in waterfall, that's because there will be some questions in the exam that are purely about predictive project management, but also that same practice could be in a hybrid project because hybrid is actually a mix between predictive and adaptive. In case there is a disagreement with the stakeholder, we mentioned that earlier, review the gap between the deliverables and the acceptance criteria, analyze the root cause, and then take action and inform the stakeholder. And we mentioned earlier in the general tips and tricks, now it depends whether they are right or we are right, but in all cases, you need to analyze the gap or analyze the cause for the disagreement. You need to take that action. You cannot just ignore it, okay? Or you cannot just update issue log. No, you need to go for an action. If there is a disagreement or a conflict, you go for the full action, okay? Net Promoter Score, NPS. So NPS and mood chart, these are tools used for measuring the stakeholder satisfaction. Okay, we've seen them in the training. With the stakeholders, a direct communication is encouraged. Okay, and usually a face-to-face communication because it's the most effective. Okay, so whenever there is a chance to have a face-to-face communication with a stakeholder, so go for it. Okay, but whenever there is a disagreement, you try to go for a direct communication with the stakeholders as a first step. Okay, if you're not successful with a direct communication, then you might consider involving the sponsor or a higher authority. Okay, when a stakeholder is not committed to the project or they skip the meetings, okay, then you go ahead and you review the stakeholder engagement plan. That's the action you need to take because maybe you did not, engage that stakeholder properly. Maybe you did not assess their level of interest or level of power or their specialty correctly. I remember in one of the questions, there were technical meetings in a project, and there was one stakeholder who was skipping them, and that stakeholder was coming from legal department. Now, why would a person coming from the legal department want to join technical meetings about product design? They don't want that. They don't understand technical stuff. They are stakeholder in that project because you need their legal advice. So you involve them in matters related to contracts, vendors, claims, administration, etc. But you don't involve them in technical discussions because that's a waste of time for them. Okay, so if the stakeholder is keeping meetings, review the stakeholder engagement plan. Okay, and you can also talk to them directly, but usually in the question in the exam, they will give you some keywords that explain to you or give you a hint why that stakeholder is skipping meetings. Okay, but that's the action you need to take when a stakeholder is not committed or is not attending meetings. Okay, if a stakeholder is complaining that they're not getting the information they need in the project reports, or if some information is missing, then in this case, you will need to review the communications management plan. We mentioned that earlier, in the previous video. We said that if any issue related to information, then you go ahead, or meetings, let's say mostly it's about information. You go ahead and review the communications management plan, which, as we said earlier, includes the level of detail, the frequency of the information, the format, etc. That's in the communications management plan. But if the issue is related to attending meetings, supporting the project, etc., that's then you review the engagement plan. Okay. Remember that engaging stakeholders by the project manager is based on their power and interest levels. Now, there isn't just power interest matrix, to be honest, okay? I think it's not mentioned anywhere in these tips and tricks. Actually, I can add it for you here. There is not just power, so different matrices. There is power, interest. There is influence, power. There is influence, interest, etc. Okay. There are other tools that also we use to assess, to analyze stakeholders. So different matrices for stakeholder analysis. So these are for stakeholder analysis. Okay. Power, interest, influence, power, influence, interest. Also, there is alliance model, stakeholder. I will write down for you. Alliance model, stakeholder cube. I mean, all of these are mentioned. All of these are mentioned in our training presentation. I didn't want, to make this just an exact copy, this coaching presentation, an exact copy of the training presentation. But these are different matrices for stakeholder analysis. Okay, so you as a project manager, you engage your project stakeholders based on their power, interest levels, and you can use the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix for monitoring their engagement. So remember, using the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. Okay, if you want to analyze how much are they engaged in your project. Okay, now remember something very important to close up with, which is managing stakeholders engagement. Listen, if you go back to page 62 in PMBOK 6, and you go to down to stakeholders, you will see that in PMBOK 6 we don't, or even in the same in the process guide in page 43, I think. In page 43 in the process guide, we don't say managing stakeholders, we say managing stakeholder engagement. So we don't manage people, like, when we talk about stakeholders, actually we manage their engagement. Okay. Okay, good. Of course, in session 3 and 4 of this coaching program, we will, answer a lot of mock questions, to touch on every bullet, almost every bullet we've seen so far in this coaching program presentation. Okay, so let's put this in a separate video. Okay, so now, guys,